Hello, everyone. I hope that you can all hear me. Welcome to MetaCell's first webinar on putting neuroscience data online. My name is Stephen Larson. I am the Chief Executive Officer of MetaCell. I'm really glad that you could all take the time to join us today to hear a little bit about what we do and some strategies that we've employed that we found very useful for putting neuroscience data online. Just a little bit about our company. We are 6 years old this year, and we have been working with different kinds of organizations over the last 6 years, primarily on the project of taking their neuroscience data, making it available to a broad audience. In doing this, we find that we've really taken data that otherwise wouldn't have seen the light of day and made it available for much greater potential for sharing and gaining insight than would have been possible before. Throughout this talk today, as we go, we're going to have some interactive polls, and also through the software, you have the ability to ask questions. So as you have any questions, please feel free to type them in. And at the end, in the last 15, 20 minutes of this presentation or so, we'll get to answering those questions. But I mentioned polls, and so we work with a large variety of organizations. In our 6-year history, we worked on projects from streaming EEG over the internet to working with the data of the famous patient HM and putting that online. We worked with universities from UCL to SUNY. We've worked with a major pharma company, and all of this around the theme of putting neuroscience data online. We've worked with academic institutions, large industries, small companies, nonprofits. So we'd actually like to get a sense of you, those of you who have showed up today, and understand a little bit more about where you're coming from. So I'm going to kick this off here first with the interactive poll. And so just let us know right now, if you would, whether you are in academia or in industry or other. See you guys answering. Folks clicking, very good. Get a few more of you in. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, we're going to close that poll. Okay, great. So it looks like so we're kind of even in all of these areas. So a little bit more academia than industry. I'm assuming others are coming from nonprofit or maybe just interested in this as an individual topic. So that's great. Thanks for that. I think that is well representative of what we've been doing at MetaCell here for the last several years in terms of the folks that keep coming back to hear about our approaches. So thanks for that. So we primarily do development across the spectrum in terms of online on the web, native applications that are deployed to desktop computers as well as mobile development. We like to consider ourselves as bridging the worlds of Silicon Valley level technology and software with PhD level research. So we think of working with our customers as gathering scientific requirements beyond just gathering software requirements. So scientific requirements gathering means that we actually can understand the science that's going on behind the data, the experiments that were run, and that tends to be very useful for making meaningful sense of the data sets that we do put up online. So we have PhD level neuroscience cross-training. Then a big focus of what we do is that we are kind of a one-stop shop for software development. So we're not just sort of one programmer in a room, but we offer complete end-to-end project management from understanding the problem space to getting into the idea space to work with you on how to solve it, and then executing all the way out to delivery and testing. And the primary way that we do that is through agile development cycles with continuous integration feedback loops, meaning that on a regular basis you're seeing what we're seeing, you're seeing the latest from what we've been able to put out. So that's how we work. I mentioned briefly the different groups that we worked with over the years. Some of these were in progress right now. Some of these we worked with in the past. And we're really grateful and honored to have been able to work with all these great institutions. So now let me speak a little bit to the point at hand. So we're talking today about putting neuroscience data online. And of course, what we have found over the years is that neuroscience data is not like other data. It is about a very specific thing, possibly the most mysterious entity that we find in the natural world, which is the brain. We work with data from human brains to other model organism brains that are of interest, and we even work with basic single cell type data. So usually we find that folks don't need our services if all they need to do is take one kind of data set and just make it available. I mean, you can share data online with Dropbox, or you can put it on a web page if all you need to do is just get data from point A to B. What we find in our landscape is that what the problem arises when you have sort of two or more data sets that are somehow related to each other. So in this case, you might think about data that's at the macro level that's looking at the whole nervous system, but maybe you also have some data that's at the more micro level where you're looking at individual neurons, some information about those neurons, whether it be dynamic data, structural data. The challenge with neuroscience is how do you bridge these together and integrate them? And after a lot of thinking and a lot of interactions with the academic community, we found that in terms of making data available, that it's very often a case-by-case situation. So far, every customer that we come to has a different set of data, and they integrate in a different way. That said, we've found ways through technology to make the process of pulling data together much faster, and that's kind of the service that we provide to our customers. So a typical example of someone coming to us is, first, that customer has data that they have full access to. This is important just to set the stage. This is not, we don't generally work with folks where, the collection of the data is itself a project. That's, I think, a different space. Then that customer has some vision for how those data are going to be shared, or maybe they have some initial system for how this works already. Then the customer works with us to help put that data online. We have now a lot of experience of sort of what are the really robust backends for making sure that data will be available today and a year from now and multiple years from now. Then we work with that customer on a case-by-case basis. We really sit down. Sometimes our requirements gathering process can be 6 weeks or more to make sure that what we're going to take the greatest care to put their data online and represent it in the highest quality form that it possibly can be. And then we go about and build that environment, and often this involves custom software development. So very often we find that you don't just drag and drop data in this way, especially, again, if it's multimodal or multi-scale. You have to do some work to hook it together and make sure that it makes sense. You need to index that data. You need to do careful work to make sure the databases in the back end are correct. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the technical requirements as we go. But that's a typical example. So we think about putting neuroscience data online in three broad ways, in three broad categories. We'll talk about them throughout the course of this webinar. We think of them in terms of visualize, in terms of collaborate, and in terms of build. So first, let me kick off the visualize with this lovely picture that we have here that comes from some work that we did with the State University of New York on a new user interface for the neuron simulation engine. If you're not familiar with it, this neuron simulation engine is a project that's been supported out of Yale University for many years, and other groups like a group that we work with at State University of New York have come to it to add user interfaces and to build an ecosystem around this. Well, we were commissioned to help move forward the project of putting a new user interface onto Neuron, and that's what you're seeing here. We'll say more about how this works a little bit later, but I want to zoom out for a second from the the specifics of Neuron and talk about what you're seeing on the screen in terms of the way that we're putting neuroscience information online. So you're seeing spinning around in 3D a morphology of a neuron that has been filled and digitized from real data. And overlaid on top of that, you're seeing a color map that's relating to the dynamics of that neuron. Now, in this case, we are simulating those dynamics based on a computational model that's behind the scenes here. But you can imagine this as a combination between structural information, which is the morphology, and dynamic information, which is the color map. So you've got two modalities, two dimensions of data. They're very different. The structural data is represented and stored completely differently than the dynamic data. Nonetheless, we fuse that together into a single environment. And what you can see is that we are combining the three-dimensional data here with two-dimensional controls that are floating on top that are providing us information about what time point we're at, that allow us to change and modify the simulation or our visualization of it over time. And so this starts to show you, just with two kinds of data, already how involved and intricate it can be to bring these together. Just to take shape data and dynamic data can be rather involved. And this is one of the things in our version of this interface that you see here, which, by the way, is available open source online for you to try, and is the subject of some study in a computational neuroscience course right now. By putting these two things together and making them available online, we can create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. We really enable insight to occur in terms of seeing exactly the patterns of dynamics that this neuron is experiencing that are harder to determine if you keep these two things visually separate. So as a consequence, visualize is a large thrust of what we think about doing when we get a new set of data. How can we make a visualization? How can we combine these data together in a way that will immediately create a picture in the mind of the user that is intuitive? Okay, so now I'm going to talk. So this is sort of looking at two different kinds of data. Now I'm going to hand the presentation over and call up our Chief Technical Officer, Matteo Cantarelli, to tell us what happens when we start to combine even more than two kinds of data sets together. So Matteo, are you there?
I hope I am. Hello, everyone.
All right. Great. Thanks for joining.
I hope you can see me and hear me. So, yes, I'll show you different software projects we work on. The first one is Virtual Flight Brain. The Virtual Flight Brain is basically a hub for neuroanatomy data of the Drosophila melanogaster, commonly known as the fruit fly. This is a project that MetaCell has done in collaboration with the Virtual Flight Brain group. There's multiple universities and institutions that belong to that. There is the University of Cambridge, the Medical Research Council in Cambridge, University of Edinburgh, European Institute for Bioinformatics. So what we do with the Virtual Flight Brain is basically we bring together different types of imaging data that are available for the fly. So in what you see there on the screen, you see different elements of the user interface. You will see essentially a big 3D canvas where we're visualizing, first of all, a reference template for the fly. This one is coming from Genilia. And then overlaid on top of it in the same 3D reference frame, we can see the neuropils of the brain. We can see a segmented neuron, like the one in yellow there, and we can see gene expression patterns as well. All of these is once again synchronized with also other elements that we can see in the interface. At the bottom right, we can see the stack viewer that lets basically the user look at confocal microscopy images, and basically we have there a stack that the user can explore in three different dimensions. And on top of that, we have a term info that essentially visualizes the ontology information associated to whatever is in focus on the screen. So the user basically can select anything on the screen, have on the right-hand side all the different information related to whatever class or individuals they are looking at, what are the relationships between each other. And Stephen, if we can go to the next slide, I want to show basically what kind of things the user can do. So since, as you can imagine, the there's a lot of stuff inside the brain, and even for the brain of a fly, this is not a difference. So there is a lot of stuff you can definitely not pull out everything together at the same time on a web browser. Therefore, what we've built allows the user to decide what they want to look at. They can load different neuropils on demand. For instance, in this case, all the ones that you see in a different color on the bottom right corner, those were loaded brain anatomy regions. And as you can see in the interface, once the user does this, the user can also query the system to ask for different types of questions. For instance, in this case, we're asking the database to show us all the different neurons that have some parts in the saddle. And the user can pick the different ones, because obviously there is many of them, and decide to visualize them and visualize also the ontology information that are associated to those specific individuals that they're loading up. If you go to the next slide, Stephen. We can see how this information comes together and how the environment is truly integrated. We can see in this case, you will notice there is a 3D plane that now is basically intersecting all the 3D models. And we can see how this plane is moving in synchrony with the stack viewer on the bottom right corner. This basically allows the user to have all the information clearly outlined. If we go to the next slide, Stephen, we can see, are we there? Yes, we are. We can see how this basically results in, well, first of all, what can probably be considered something beautiful to just look at, because there is a lot of beauty inside the brain, and one of the things that we like to do is bring that out and be able to visualize it. And but it's also a very useful tool that allows researchers, in this case of the fruit fly, all around the world to look at data in unprecedented ways, to do things that they were not able to do before, and essentially to do better science. Stephen, I think.
Great. Thanks, Matteo. So what you saw there was what happens when we really combine all sorts of data sets together into, in this case, an integrated 3D brain atlas. Now, that goes way beyond just two kinds of data. Obviously, you saw there ontologies, you saw those shapes of neurons combined with the whole atlas, you know, the anatomical atlas, in this case, of the fly brain. You saw query mechanisms. All of these things are pieces that need to be carefully considered and built in order to share data in this way. But when you do, you create an environment and experience where, which is highly conducive to exploration. So what we find is that these different kinds of data are, again, really different for everybody. So we wanted to actually also use this as another chance to ask you guys and gals that are out there in the audience another poll question. So I'm going to be putting this up right now. So this question is about what kind of neuroscience data you're primarily working with. Of course, you may be working with multiple, maybe you're working with other, but please just go ahead and give us your best shot at answering this one, if you will. So I see votes are coming in. All right, we'll give you guys another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you guys. Quick on the trigger there. Appreciate that. All right, so let's have a look. Okay, so it looks like there's actually quite a lot of folks. Majority are working with EEG, but in general, there's a lot of diversity after there. It's pretty much even with some of those other data types, and that's very much what we find. Again, folks don't want to just necessarily share one type of data. They often have that along with other information. So the question of putting neuroscience data online is very rarely about just one kind of data. It's very often about creating an integrated environment and how well can you integrate the data together in order to create experiences like what Matteo just showed you with the virtual fly brain. So I'm going to take that down. Thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, to say a little bit more about collaboration. So we talked about it in the context of the data, but as those of us in the neuroscience research industry understand, the type of data is something which is often an end product of a skill set. And those skill sets are hard to get and take a long time to acquire. Often folks have to spend many years in graduate school or many years of training in an industry setting in order to produce the kinds of data that we use inside neuroscience. It's one of the reasons why it's so challenging, because so much training has to go into producing that data. So what we find here, and and this is, believe it or not, a very simple kind of a diagram compared to the kinds of processes that we find. But a map like this is something that we use internally to help us understand how different partners fit together, and in terms of what data products they're going to produce. So in the context of doing something like creating an atlas, you might work with an analytics partner who has the skill set to be able to segment a volumetric data set and turn it into the kinds of shape files that are amenable to sharing online. So you might have one set of partners that are working in that way. You might have another set of partners that are working to do reconstructions of individual neurons, like the kinds that you saw there, which may involve deciding which neurons to reconstruct, and then being able to make sure that your reconstructions have appropriate landmarks so that they can be put in the context of the larger anatomical atlas, so they can be scaled appropriately, so they can be oriented appropriately, and then so that they can be mapped into a coordinate system. And that skill set is still different from what computational users or software engineers need to do in order to understand the requirements for how this data is going to be shown. What happens when your mouse hits the screen? What do you expect to see? What order of information do you want to show there? What should be the behavior? What's the level of responsiveness that you need in all cases? Where is it okay to have a loading bar versus not? So what we find is that putting neuroscience data online is very much about building the right collaboration of skilled people, skilled people that know how to work with the data, that understand how they want the data to appear. If you don't build the right collaboration, putting neuroscience data online is it's not going to be as effective as you want, and probably not going to have your end users getting the kinds of insights that they want. So to talk about some environments where collaboration is actually the focus of the output. So one side of it is collaboration for building the systems, and the other side is to build collaborations around data and environments that we've constructed. I'm going to bring Matteo back to talk about some other work that we have done. Matteo?
Yes. Hello again. So we looked earlier on at virtual flight brain, and again, in that project, as we've seen, we were pulling together different types of imaging data that are available and assembled together for the fly. In this case, I want to show you open source brain. In this case, we'll be dealing with computational models instead, and this is a project that we worked on in collaboration with University College London at the lab of Professor Angus Silver. And basically, in here, it's different types of data that we're looking at, because basically, when we talk about computational models, we're talking about models that help scientists make predictions about how a cell or particular circuits might behave according to a set of formally defined mathematical hypotheses. In this case, it takes advantage of a standard language named NeurML that is used to describe the math behind this model. What we're looking at here is a circuit created by Dave Beeman at University of Colorado of the primary auditory cortex. And essentially, we see a network where there is two different populations. There is a population of pyramidal cells. There is a population with basket cells. And in this environment, you can explore the structure of this network. In this case, we can see, for instance, adjacency matrix, a type of widget that visualizes how the different neurons are connected to each other, and basically what are the inputs and outputs of the system. And we see that there's also a 2D plot there of a time series of what in this case is basically showing how the membrane potential is varying across whatever selected cell we have there. So this is a web environment. Once again, in this case, though there is an online simulation that is happening, there are results of the simulations that are getting streamed to the browser, and essentially we have the user performing those operations that in general would have required in the past installing complex tool chains that more often than not were not working as easily on every system, and essentially lowering the entrance barrier also for the neuroscience, the computational neuroscience field itself. Right? We found that it is much easier for students, for instance, that want to start venturing into neuroscience to do so, learning using these web interfaces that basically cut essentially to whatever features are required. And yes, they can also expose more advanced workflows, but make it very easy to start working with this type of models. And there should be also another slide on OSP, Stephen. And yes, where we again see the network, and we can see how we can replay the simulation in this case. And as we can see, there's a bit of a Christmas tree here as the different cells are lighting up as a result of the change of the membrane potential. And one thing I would like you guys to think about is how these two universes that we've shown so far, first of all, Virtual Fly Brain and now open source brain, are very interesting if we look at them by themselves. So we've seen, imaging data for the fly. We've seen computational models for here in open source brain. But one thing that we believe will basically bring out a lot in neuroscience are those applications that we have not yet built that will fuse together these two things, where we can bring together experimental data so that you can visualize, for instance, your electrophysiology traces in the same space where you can work with computational models, therefore being able to compare the two, being able to acquire data that are needed because you're looking at a computational model and you're saying, okay, we should really do an experiment to give us this information to see if the model is accurate, and at the same time closing the loop by building better models because you have the data available there in your space, and you're like, oh yeah, the model is not behaving quite as it should as soon as we're looking at it in this different perspective. So we believe that bringing together these two types of environments, experimental and computational one, ultimately will be very useful for the field as a whole. Now, I have another couple of slides where I want to show you something that Stephen was already talking about earlier on with Neuron UI, to essentially show different types of deployments. So we've seen with both Virtual Fly Brain and open source brain that we're basically talking about web applications. Okay, so the user goes to a web site and they start, in one case, looking at the anatomy of the fly. In the other case, they start working with one of the hundreds models that are available in open source brain. But in this case, we're looking at, although I will give you that it is confusing because it looks very similar, but in this case, we're looking at a local application that is actually running on someone's computer, in this case, connected to a Python kernel. And we see that there are pros and cons. I have a slide about this later on. But essentially, in this case, what is interesting and why I'm showing you this is basically, in this case, what this user interface that you're looking at is hooked up with is a Python API, and this doesn't need to be, something sophisticated that someone built a server with a RESTlet APIs to specify all the different workflows. No, here we have essentially a user interface where behind each button, behind each user interface element, you can basically connect the environment to a specific Python variable, to a specific Python method, and therefore it's a way to rapidly develop user interfaces, taking advantage of all the features that we've built also in the case of web applications, but it is a way of taking advantage of all these features, but basically to create essentially sort of a computational sandbox for your models and your simulators. So in this case, in this gift that keeps going, you're probably sick of looking at it by now, but what is happening there is that we're building a model by changing the different compartments of this Hodgkin axle. We're making the soma bigger. We're making the segments in the sections of this neuron model smaller or shorter, and then we start recording at different sections and so on. The same type of functionality that we've seen earlier in open source brain, but coming from a very different type of deployment. And there should be another slide about this. Yes, and once again, in this case, we see how we are basically recording a space plot for at different sections in this Hodgkin axle model, and we're replaying the simulation. For those of you that have used the Neuron before, obviously this is called Neuron UI. So if there are some things that look familiar, it's because in collaboration, this is something that we built in collaboration with the Neuroscience lab at the New York State University and Yale University, where basically as a prototype, we went through elements of the old neural interface that was built with interviews, and we replicated them using web technologies with results that everybody was very happy about. And however, there is not 100% by any means of the functionality that existed in Neuron. This was a useful prototype to see what things we could do as we venture into building new interfaces for computational neuroscience. I should have one last slide. There you go. Where basically I just want to summarize these two different types of deployments. On the left-hand side, we have the client servers like open source brain and virtual flight brain. On the right-hand side, we have this deployment that is based on top of Jupyter Notebook. So on the left-hand side, pros, it works with any modern browser. It doesn't require to install any type of software. It is inherently multi-user because anybody can go to the website at the same time and work with this model. Work with these models. It is built on an architecture that has a Java backend essentially, and a front end that is reused in both deployments. That is built with basically modern technologies. For those of you who are into software development, we use Webpack, we use React.js, and pretty much 3JS for the 3D visualizations. And every library that you can possibly imagine is fused together into a framework that is an open source platform that we've been contributing to as MetaCell from the very beginning, that is called Geppetto. This platform is open source. We keep contributing to it and using it in different projects. On the right-hand side, there is the other type of deployment that we've seen with Neuron UIs, where basically we are connecting to a local Python kernel. We have these computational sandbox environments where we can visualize and simulate local data. In this case, we have the advantage that there is not a network in between the system that is visualizing and the system where the data sits, so there is no problems with bandwidth. For instance, you go to open source brain, and of course you have to wait a few seconds or even 20 seconds, 30 seconds if you're loading something very big. In this case, you're not loading anything because everything is sitting in your computer. It is a private deployment, so you don't need to trust any private servers, and we know how scientists are very protective about, rightfully protective about the work that they do. And it is integrated with Jupyter Notebook. That is something that more and more scientists are familiar with and use for their experiments. But once again, the front end is reused, and it is the same essentially as what we're using for the client server, which is ultimately all coming from the open source platform, Geppetto. And I think those are all the slides I have. So back to Stephen.
Great, thank you, Matteo. So that was really helpful for folks to get a better sense of idea of Collaborate, how it works, how different folks can work together both on a client-server system, and also they can use a system that is deployed to the local desktop to produce computational models, to work with electrophysiology data and try to model it in their local environment and then share it. So at this point, we've gone through visualize. We've talked about how visualizations are really important. We've talked about collaboration and how really putting neuroscience data online requires us to work with people with different skill sets and different data backgrounds, and building right collaboration is critical. And now we're going to talk a little bit about build and what that really means. I'd just like to remind everybody at this point, we're getting close to the end, so if you've had other questions that have come up in the last few minutes or on anything that we've talked about so far, questions are still open, so please type them in. After this section, we will, I already see there's quite a few good questions that have been asked, so thank you so far to those who have posted. We'll be getting to those right after this section. So here we go. All right, so the last area that we find consistently in the projects that we've worked on has to do with this idea of build. And this can be a little subtle, so it's often overlooked. But what we find is that it's one thing to, have a prototype visualization, and it's another thing to get what you think are the right people all together in the room and design the way they're going to work together. But what we found as we've transitioned, many of us, from the neuroscience lab setting and the university to an industrial company that works on the basis of deadlines and deliverables and commitments to make sure that something is rock solid when it goes up, is that this last component is perhaps the most important component. How do you actually build this system? How do you get this system online? How do you ensure that the system works every time? So we find that's a combination of three things. One, process control and standards. So this relates to using the best-in-class industry standards for everything that we do. We don't, hack something together and throw it online. As Matteo was showing you, we reuse many libraries that have been built already that have large user communities, things where it's easy to get help or improve something or fix a bug. And we are strong participants in the open source community. We very often contribute back the fixes that we find of different libraries as we go. And so that's part of a really important ecosystem. It's very critical as well that we use all the best tools in terms of code repositories, in terms of agile development, as I mentioned to you before. So that's really critical. The second component, of course, as we've been saying, is experience with the data itself. So very often, software companies that don't come from a neuroscience background can overlook very important details in the data. You really want somebody who is trained and understands exactly what's happening in this experiment and really what the data are intending to measure about the brain in order to fully understand how to build a system that's going to be useful. And the last component is full stack software engineering best practices. So here, we've really brought together a very talented team that, in our case, that has 10 years or more each individually experience with software and the details and the depth of software, the ways that software can go wrong, and the pitfalls that can befall you when you say start with a prototype and then try to scale it up to a full system. And just as a sort of example of that, right? So very often it's the case that we find an organization that comes to us where they have a vision, okay, of say a beautiful Halloween-themed gingerbread house that they want to make. As we're coming up to Halloween, I thought this would be an appropriate example. They have this vision in mind, and it's going to be spooky, and boy, is everybody going to comment on how neat the gingerbread house is that they've built. But as they start down the road, whether, and this is across the board, whether you're a PI in a university and you've hired just one undergrad to try and hack some code together, or whether you're a software team in a major pharma company, but your developers kind of are very talented in their own right, but they're not really trained in neuroscience. So very often we find that what comes out is something that looks a little bit more like this, where it was a fair try, good attempt, the vision was probably great, but in the execution, unfortunately, there was some things that were still left to be desired. So don't do this. So essentially what we found is that the difference between these two things can come down to problems that are genuinely hard. Things like, how do you deal with compression to make sure that the large data sets that you have that you want to share can get squeezed through the little tunnel that you have on the internet. Topics like how do you put all the things on the screen that you want to see at the same time? Very often, folks will start with a prototype where they put 2, 3 things on the screen, and then suddenly they have all this other data they want to put up, and they want to put a few hundred things on the screen, and then it all, breaks down, unfortunately. That is another sort of unknown engineering problem that you'll often run into. A third one that we run into as well is that it's one thing to build a framework to share one kind of data, but to really build a abstraction layer, to use an engineering term, that is supportive of multiple types of data to come together easily is actually quite a hard industry problem. And many other fields in engineering industry find this problem again and again. So those are three examples of why the build topic is so important. It's so important to us. It's important in general if you want to actually effectively make that data go online and not just have something that, you know, is demo quality but won't really stand up when the users start coming. Okay, so to summarize, what we've found in our experience as this company has progressed over the last 6 years is that to really make the most value of neuroscience data, to assemble it online, you need to build some specialized software tools. We think about throughout our projects that you need to combine multimodal data sets, often chiefly around some kind of a unifying visualization. You need to make sure that you have the right research team to produce data correctly, and you want to think about how you can ensure that your visualizations will be used by multiple people, how you can build collaboration as a process into whatever software that you're creating. So your software isn't just, I'll send you the data, but it's how can people work with that data within the system. And then finally, we think about it in the context of actually building. What is the, you know, hard-nosed, put your nose to the grindstone kind of process that you need to make sure that this thing actually makes it online, will actually stand up, isn't going to be down half the time. So that is our main content. By the way, as a reminder, myself and Matteo are going to be around at Society for Neuroscience 2017 in Washington, D.C. here in a few weeks. We would love to meet with you in person, buy you a coffee, talk more about neuroscience data and the state of it today. So please let us know if that's something that you're open to or interested in, and we'd love to talk to you. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions that have come through. And I already saw one question, actually, that I wanted to address. So a question came through about the virtual FlyBrain query selector. So you remember earlier, Matteo had an interface that he was demonstrating in virtual FlyBrain where people were able to make searches. And the question is, are you using are you evaluating the searches that are made, essentially, the questions that people are asking for further optimization of search? Or are they, in the questioner asks, one-sided? So I think what they're getting at is, are you analyzing how people are, you know, responding to the queries to potentially make the queries better? I will let Matteo give the full answer for this. My understanding is that at the moment, the main requirement deliverable was to make sure that the use case, that the query was possible, and that logging the queries is something that may occur in the back end, but I don't believe has been made available for analysis. But Matteo may have more better answer on that. Matteo, is that your understanding?
Yes, Stephen, that is essentially correct. The one thing we have done, though, is, and it goes again to what you were saying earlier about, building an engineering model, an abstraction that can be used in order to represent the data, is that we have basically decoupled essentially the queries that can be executed from the code. So one thing that we have done, because we didn't have the requirements of, analyze the queries that are executed so that they become faster and so on. We just have standard caching mechanism so that if a query was recently executed, then it would run faster, but we don't have any optimization beyond that. But one thing that we do have is a declarative specification of these queries that is independent of the code, which means that the very talented folks at Virtual FlyBrain, as they want to add new queries or as they want to iterate over those queries, they don't need to touch any code as they decide to provide new available queries for different types of data, different classes or individuals.
Great. Okay, so another questioner asks if the data are available for open access for research purposes. And this is a good lead-in to clarify something that has been a theme that ran through a few questions, which is, so at Metacell, we are not a data repository. So we do not ourselves collect any of the data that you've seen and put it under some database that we are in any way in control of. What you've been seeing throughout this presentation are the interfaces to data that we have built on behalf of whomever our customer is. So if we're approached by an industry group, if we're approached by a research group, an academic lab, an academic collaboration, often they'll be the ones bringing the data or the data source. Actually, 100% of the time, they're the ones bringing the data or the data source to us, and their challenge is just how do we assemble it together. So the interfaces that you've seen, all those data are hosted and are, owned, and are the ownership of it resides with whomever comes to us, the organization that comes to us. So many of those data are available in open access for research purposes. In fact, everything that we've shown you, I believe, is the whole purpose was to make it to take open access data and make it even more visible and available than otherwise available. But at the end of the day, that is always the responsibility of whomever we're talking to. So it's not our goal to, be a data repository. There's lots of great organizations that do that. We're not really trying to reinvent the wheel there. For us, what we've seen is that very often it's not so much about, being able to share the data or finding data can be challenging, but to actually unlock it and to put it online in an interface tends to be the biggest challenge. I don't know, Matteo, did you want to say anything about that?
No, that's spot on. Both Virtual Flight Brain and Open Source Brain are publicly available. So for those two data sets that you guys have looked at, you can look at them, download them, and so on. Great.
Another question asks, and by the way, thanks everybody for these questions. These are really great questions. Another question asks, do you assume that data quality is high prior to attempting to merge multimodal data, or is that the responsibility of those providing you with the data? Yeah, great question as well. So tying into what I just said, given that, in our case, data that we work with are provided by the organization that is working with us, the primary responsibility for the data quality lies with that organization, and our mission begins with taking that data and making it available in the highest quality way possible. That said, because we have experience in neuroscience data ourselves, we often give organizations feedback about their data if there is a place where quality can be improved. Very often, I would also say that the data that are associated with these resources have been attached to publications that have come out, and the publications themselves have been peer-reviewed. So the peer review process there allows for, the basic data checking that occurs. That said, reviewers don't always look through every single line of data, so there's some challenges there. But we also think that making data available is a way to increase data quality, especially putting more eyes on the data can often be a great way to see if something makes sense. Potentially, a slide could get left out accidentally from the data set that we've received. And so pointing that back out to the users. We do plenty of QA checks on our own, but there are some things that will only lie in the data itself. So chiefly it's the responsibility of those providing us with the data, but we do give feedback, and we do try to ensure that whatever we build an interface around is as high quality as possible. Great. Another question that we got there, I guess it sort of ties onto that. Do we create systems that test for quality in some way? One of the best practices in software engineering that we ascribe to is unit testing and interface testing, both. So unit testing relates to testing the code to make sure that all the functions and features work as expected every time code is changed. So literally every time anybody makes a change to the code base and submits it, all these tests get run. And the other one is interface testing, where we basically have a robot that loads up the application and clicks on different interfaces and opens things up and tries to break the interface. And that's the second way that we test quality in terms of the interface. We are also working with organizations that actually get involved in testing data. There's it's an interesting research area around comparing, say, models to data, checking data quality. That's kind of a growth area for us right now. If you're interested in that more, I'm happy to talk about that more offline. Yeah, so those are some ways that we do quality checks, which I think are part of that build category very much. Great. Let's see. Matteo, do you see any questions in the list that you think you'd like to
I
answer?
was double checking that we're answering everything, yes.
So here's one that just came in about APIs. So have you needed to build APIs to allow accessing data programmatically? If so, can you briefly describe the APIs? I think I'll let Matteo do the first shot at that, and I'll fill in any gaps that you might miss. Not that he'll miss.
A project that we're currently working on that we have not yet released, and that I won't be able to share some of the details yet, but this is exactly what we're doing. So it is starting with what is, a regular, in this case, Python library that has, some methods, some snippets that basically do some operations over the data. But as we are building a web application on top of this, then we are going through the specification of that library, essentially creating a RESTlet API that can be used in order to upload the data, in order to retrieve the data, analyze the data, perform some computation on the data, and so on. Let me think in terms of accessing the data programmatically. I don't know if you would consider, for instance, even what we have done with Neuron UI, in a sense, accessing the data programmatically, because essentially you can think of the Neuron package having its own API, and in this case, interfacing with this API in order to do all sorts of operations that you can perform on a neuronal model. I'm not 100% sure I answered all of it. Stephen, maybe you have also some other insight?
Well, also because I find sometimes folks coming from different backgrounds may find some jargon they're unfamiliar with. So just so folks understand, API stands for Application Programmer Interface, and it is a best practice in software engineering to essentially build a layer that allows systems to access without getting into the details or specifics of what's inside it. So an API is often used to create a black box around some piece of functionality. And sometimes these are, the whole point of a project is to build an API, and other times an API is built in a process of developing a visualization. Sometimes it's done in the process of developing an interface to some data. So I'd say that we are often building these layers within our project. Sometimes we're not writing them for the purpose of making them available to everybody. Sometimes we're writing them so that our front end can talk to our back end. There are APIs that are kind of baked in and built in under the hood in some of the open source frameworks that we use, primarily Geppetto, for being able to access the front end very easily. So I'd say that APIs kind of run throughout our stack in many ways. And we're also able to, if someone says, okay, we specifically want you to, all you need to do is build an API, that's easy for us to do as well. So that comes up often. Okay, well, folks, thank you very much for the questions. I think that's about all the time that we have today. We really appreciate you joining us again. If you are going to be a Society for Neuroscience, please drop us a line. And following this presentation, there is a brief survey. It will take 5 minutes of your time. I personally know that everyone is awash with surveys today, so I know that it's a lot to ask. But if you would have just a few minutes, we really, really would appreciate you just filling that survey out and letting us know a little bit more about you and what questions that you have, because we're constantly in the process of learning as well. We certainly don't think that we are the absolute experts of the world in this topic, but we're very interested in it and interested in learning from you. So stay tuned. This won't be our last webinar. We will be doing more in the future. If you got the invite to this, you are on our mailing list. And thanks so much for joining. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.